Well, hello everyone. This is Windsor Community Church with another Wednesday blog, and today is May the 12th, 2020. And for those of you who don't know where Windsor Church is, we're in Otago, New Zealand. And today my special guest is Professor David Toombs, and I'd just like to read a little bit about him. So David took up the director role at the centre of the Howard Paterson Chair of Theology and Public Issues in January 2015. That's at Otago University in Dunedin. David is a lay Anglican theologian and has a long-standing interest in contextual and liberation theologies. And he's written a book called Latin America Liberation Theologies, published by Brill in 2002. So that's your free advertising, David. His current research focuses on religion, violence, and public theology, and especially on Christian responses to gender-based violence, sexual abuse, and torture. And he welcomes proposals for study in these areas. Previously, David was a lecturer in theology at the University of Roehampton, London, and then he lived and worked in Belfast, Northern Ireland, as assistant professor of conflict resolution and reconciliation for the Irish School of Ecumenics, Trinity College, Dublin. So that's a pretty good blurb to begin with, David. So welcome for taking the time. So I just want to ask you some questions, and it revolves around the government's response to COVID-19. And as we've just talked about before we've started recording, I think we're both very impressed with the way that the government has managed this crisis, this disaster. And so it's not so much about bagging the government, but it's teasing out some of the fringe type of questions that have raised in my mind. So would you like to begin by just, giving us your view on how the government's done?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's very good of you to have me on and this chance to chat. My own take on it is the government have done New Zealand well. They've taken bold and clear decisions in a situation where nobody's known for sure what the outcomes are likely to be. But on the whole, they've got it overwhelmingly right, I think, and that they deserve both praise and thanks. I have family members in both the US, because I'm married to a US citizen, and in the UK, which is where I'm from originally. And looking at things there, I think it's a much more troubling pattern. It's a much more disturbing set of circumstances. And so I'm profoundly grateful to have been in New Zealand during this very difficult time.
We'll get on to your views of America, for example. Everyone's got views on America. We'll come to that later. For me, as a minister, there's a couple of things that have caught my attention, and this is from a kind of a theological point of view, and a very strong believer in the freedom of religion and association, recognizing that there is quite a divide between church and state in New Zealand. But one of the things I would like your opinion on is, is the whole area of kind of managing the different views on the issue. You do have to cut out the wackies, but the scientific community have varying views. And would you like to comment on how that has gone, in your opinion?
So in my opinion, things have gone well. It's on the assumption, I think now, that a vaccine will be found. If a vaccine isn't found, or if it's a very, very long time until the vaccine is found, I think we'll look back and see that although decisions were made with good intentions, they weren't actually the best decisions. But certainly my profound hope is, and I think the government expectation is, that a vaccine will be found. And in that light, the New Zealand strategy will, to my mind, have been the right one. And I think it's been the right one because it seems to me it's followed the best credible scientific advice, recognizing that we do not know with certainty all the variables. We've had to make decisions between them, but I think they've made good decisions. They've put the emphasis on safety and life and health. And I think personally that was the right place to put it. So we're now moving into a new situation in the light of a transition to level 2, where perhaps there's more argument, more different opinions on freedom of assembly. How is that to be reconciled with an emphasis on health and protection? But certainly, so looking forward, I can see those issues are going to come up. And certainly if it is the case, there's more freedom of assembly in a bar to drink than there is to meet together in a church. That would be a very strange thing if that's part of level 2. But looking back at where we've been on level 4 and level 3, I think the government puts the emphasis fairly and squarely on everybody's safety, and that was the right thing to do.
Yeah, the decision to drop down to 10 for funerals and church gatherings, it really surprised me. I went, oh, bother, when I heard it. And in the sense that the Prime Minister was also saying it's okay to go to the movies or go to a show. So I think her explanation was kind of that Christians hug too much and stuff like that. So
that's a very interesting perception of Christians. It is. It's fascinating. That perception's out there. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's it's fascinating. I've just mentioned funerals. Like one of my bugbears, and one of my previous Wednesday blogs, I interviewed a local funeral director, and that was at the beginning of level 4. And, he expressed the real anguish from his professional point of view of, families not being able to grieve and to celebrate the life of their loved one. And it's still, the number's still set at 10 for a funeral. For me, it's that there's kind of been a thread of inhumanity. I know that's a bit hard, but there's been that thread through the whole thing that denies kind of who we are as humans and our spiritual side, whether we're Christian or not. Got any comment on that?
Mm-hmm. So it's really illuminating for me to hear that pastoral perspective on it, because I suppose in my bubble, in my lockdown, I've been very focused on helping the students finish their papers online, on keeping the various commitments I have. I haven't been drawn into that particular pastoral situation, and I can imagine that if I had been, it would bring home the difficulties involved. I think I would still see it, as you suggest, as still hard to describe that as inhumanity, because I genuinely believe that it's done with the well-being of all in mind. So although I can imagine, particularly for those who've gone through that very difficult and painful process during the lockdown period, it was hugely disappointing. It would have been devastating, I'm sure, to have had to farewell loved ones in those circumstances. I personally think it would be unfair to judge the government's policy too negatively in this light, because I do believe that it was done with the welfare of all to the fore.
Yeah, which just raises another question now that we're beginning to get going. So what's your opinion on the government? Like they have to make decisions for the large group. Where does a government, in your opinion, where does a government cross a line when they actually marginalise smaller groups or individuals like grieving families? Because it has caused a lot of angst. It is I interviewed the moderator of PCNZ last week, and I asked him to please, next time he meets with the Prime Minister, please tell her how damaging that part of the policy has been. So I've still got a bone to chew on this one. Yeah.
Yep, and that's fair enough, absolutely. And those who've had that experience and have that pain and disappointment have every right to express that view powerfully, particularly to those who are unaware of how negatively they've been impacted. At the same time, at least from a government perspective, it needs to be balanced against the overview picture of the good of all, and particularly the protection of the vulnerable in wider society. So nobody would suggest that this has been a good thing in terms of that there's been a global pandemic, that there's been world-shattering events which have happened. There has been a cost that some, in terms of family terms, will have carried much more heavily than others who've been relatively privileged through this. At the same time, it's one thing to register this has been tremendously painful. It's another thing to say the government got it wrong. I'm not persuaded that the government got it wrong, but I do think we need to hear that pain. And the reason I don't think the government got it wrong is because the good of all was upheld, and especially the vulnerable were protected. I mean, one thing which I'm mindful of is the situation that many of the economically disadvantaged in New Zealand face during an ordinary winter is very, very difficult, with housing stock, with temperatures down. Had we been going into winter, whereby we'd need to be under lockdown in bubbles, that would have been a really difficult experience for a lot of Kiwis. I think taking strong, but to my mind, prudent action early on has hopefully got us into a different place before the very, very difficult winter season will start. And I think that's helped some of New Zealand's most vulnerable people in terms of this wider pandemic.
You make some interesting points, which I'll mull over in the middle of the night. So that's cool.
Here's another one, if I may, Peter. May I throw
it
back to you? So I don't know if you've seen, or if your viewers have seen, the movie Contagion. This is one of the movies that I think got streamed a lot.
First one I watched, level 4.
Right. I mean, one of the things which I think is tremendously salutary in that movie is the breakdown in civil order. What that movie shows, for viewers who are perhaps not familiar with it, is remarkably prescient of what actually happened in a lot of ways. A coronavirus coming out of China, creating a global pandemic, a scramble to respond to it, an incredibly high infection level. But in the movie, it leads to a complete breakdown in civil order, rioting, shops being trashed, major unrest. Now, we haven't come anywhere close to that, and nor has any other country. The absence of that, for most people, just gets taken for granted, perhaps. It's something which hasn't happened and therefore doesn't get mentioned. But actually, it is important to weigh, along with everything else we're talking about, in terms of the negative consequences of the pandemic, in terms of looking at the response that there's been to it. The sort of world-shattering event we've had could easily have led to much worse civil unrest and violence than has actually happened. And it's a good thing for all of us that it hasn't happened, but we shouldn't just forget about that possibility when we come to think about the response which has been made to it.
Yeah, I've got two thoughts there. First, I think we're only beginning this COVID journey, really. Like, I think it'll be in 5 years' time, we can look back and see whether the government has made the right decisions. And I've often reflect too, like if we have to jump back to level 3 or even level 4 in New Zealand, with the second wave, whatever they call it, I'll be very interested to see how civil obedience will hold in those circumstances. So this discussion kind of brings me to thinking about America, and I know that you might have an opinion or two on America, but they're teetering on civil unrest at the moment. It's growing, and from my point of view, it's that big conflict between the Americans' idea of their inalienable rights as human beings under the Constitution, and the government telling them you can't do something. So they've kind of got a different cultural view than us. So you got comments about that kind of thing and about what's happening in America.
Yeah, thanks for including this element into the discussion. I do follow the news in America fairly closely. I spent a year there as a graduate student. I'm married to an American. We visit sort of fairly regularly, and we have family there. So we do follow it closely. And I think it's really exposing some of the dramatic divisions and fault lines in American society. And you've sketched some of the dynamics in terms of the politics, the tension between individual freedom and government regulation. But I think in New Zealand that's been a smoother process in terms of how you weigh those two. In the US, you've got that tension, but you've also had a president who seems to have gone against the government and in favor of encouraging people to embrace individual freedoms when it's democratic governors who are doing the governing. So there's a much more complex dynamic of encouraging people to reject government regulation and restrictions in democratic states from a president who is in a position of power and responsibility, and I think that's contributed to the civil unrest you touch on, and it's certainly not yet as bad as it could be, but it is a very difficult situation there because there's much less confidence in government authority, and part of that is because the message from government has been so mixed, even in opposition.
Yeah, because I think in America, the governors of the states, I was reading the other day that the people will listen to their governors before they'll listen to the president. So the president's actually got to get the governors on side with him before, things can roll out. So I thought that was interesting.
I think there's a big difference between the blue states and the red states. So in the red states, the Republican states, many of the governors are looking to open up the states and open up the economy, and Trump is encouraging that. In the blue states, they're concerned about that, and Trump has actively encouraged people to protest against that. I think the other big issue in the states is the racial dynamic, that the ones who are going to carry the cost of the opening up of the economy, if that's done too early, and there is this pressure to do that, are primarily going to be Black and Hispanic members of the population. And it certainly seems in some of the red states that there is at best an indifference to their safety and health and this is, I think, a challenging issue for Christians, but particularly Christians in the red states who've tended to be on the pro-life side of arguments. There now seems to be an indifference to the life of actually some people in those states. And I think that's deeply troubling in terms of the church valuing the common good and the well-being of everybody, especially the most vulnerable.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'll mull that one over too that night. You got any comments about Britain? You're from there, and how Prime Minister Boris is. I think he started off a bit stumbly, but what's the kind of dynamics? It'd be good. You've mentioned the Christian perspective. So you got comments about Britain and what's happened there and the response of the church.
I think Boris at least seemed to be in a sort of denial. It wasn't an absolute blanket denial, but it was a denial or a lack of imagination of where this was going to go. and his initial reaction was asserting, that the freedoms of the English person, that the English citizen would not be restricted by government. I think he said English. He might have said British, but I think his language might well have tended towards English. But I may be unfair to him on that. But essentially saying citizens in the UK are not going to have their freedoms taken away from them. And actually, history proved him to be dramatically wrong and misguided in that it was inevitable with this pandemic that freedoms would have to be restricted. And if you don't do that, then the pandemic will spread. Since his own illness and recovery, he's seemed to be much more careful and cautious, but now he has the challenge of what to do with the economy. He has those who are arguing that it needs to be reopened. I think UK has a much tougher next few months than in New Zealand. That they don't have the option that it looks like New Zealand has got to, whereby it's more or less eliminated, or at least very low levels in terms of community transmission. And then if the border is essentially closed, it should be possible to wait and see if a quarantine can be, if a vaccine can be developed. The UK doesn't have that option. It's moving into summer, and then not very far beyond that there's autumn and then winter coming again, and the prospect of a second wave. So it's really tough there, I think.
So coming back to New Zealand and looking forward, with the border closed, that is a huge concern for the economy. And you read that this vaccine might take a year to get here, maybe 2. Who knows? Be good if it was here in 6 weeks. What are your thoughts about, let's say, the next year, when the economy is really locked down, and we're relying on domestic economy? What's your comment, and maybe bring in the response, a possible response for the church?
Mm-hmm. So it is a very sobering perspective. I mean, as yet, I don't think anyone's really talked in detail about how this is going to be paid for. How are the costs going to be spread? And that's going to be the very difficult conversation which is going to come. Some have been much more directly impacted by what's happened so far than others, but overall, the big cost item has not really been addressed. I think that's now on the agenda for the future. One of the things the churches can do, I think, is to keep reminding people what the economy is for. The economy is to serve the people, not people to serve the economy. So the big issue is not about, what needs to be done for the economy, but what does the economy need to do for us? What we wanting our economy to do, and how do we make decisions that bring that about? So that is an important role for the church, because other decision makers may lose track of that, may become so focused on the economic questions and what to do with the economy that they don't ask the even bigger question of, well, what's actually the economy for? The economy is to serve New Zealand, not vice versa. And that's something the churches should be reminding people. That doesn't solve all the problems in any way, but it does give a shared basis to talk about it.
That's an interesting point as well. Well, I have kind of run out of my questions. Like, I could go on a lot longer and get deeper and deeper into politics and probably put your career at risk and stuff like that. But
please don't do that.
No, I won't do that. So thank you so much for your time, and some of your insights have been quite interesting, informative. And I'll give you a chance. Is there anything else you would like to say before we sign off?
No, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, Peter, and it's been my chance to sort of speak and think through some of these things. So they are slightly half-formed. I wouldn't want necessarily to be quoted on them without a chance to come back and flesh them out a bit further. But it's been great to chat to you on them. Thanks very much for your interest and the invitation.
Okay, thank you very much. And just as we sign off, his background is my old university, which I'm very proud of. So anyway,
it doesn't actually look like this at this time of year, but for me, this is one of the very best views of University of Otago, so I like to use it.
Yeah, we need a bit of springtime in this autumn time. Yeah, that's cool. So thank you very, very much, David, and maybe we'll catch you again sometime. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter.